I will ask you a question and I will be very direct. Do you believe in life after death? My name is Andrew and I'll tell you the truth. That's something I wonder about a lot. I've been a doctor for several years now and I'm in constant contact with death. I have seen more people die than you will ever see in your lifetime. In some cases, I felt that nothing could be done, but in others, I felt quite guilty for not having done a better job. Whatever the case, even if I was a very good doctor, not everything went my way. But no matter how many nights I was with patients, I never saw as much death as I did that night. Do you know what the worst thing is? That only one patient died that night, but something happened in the hospital. Something I will never understand and never want to see again. It all happened with the arrival of a girl. Obviously, I can't say her name, so let's call her Jane. Jane arrived at the place in a coma. The parents were very Catholic, and they used very unconventional medicine on her. Sometimes those things work on patients as a placebo, but when health is in the way, the only way to fix these problems is with a doctor. But this girl? Hell, she was a totally different case. We couldn't figure out what was wrong with her. The girl had gone through a lot of stages before she went into a coma. In the beginning, she had very strange behaviors that suggested a multiple personality disorder. Over time, this developed into more unexplainable things. Things in her house would move. Dead birds would appear around her. And it was even said that the rooms Jane was in would freeze over for a short time, even in the middle of summer. You can imagine where this is coming from, can't you? Yes, that's what you can imagine. The report said that the reason Jane was in a coma was because she had undergone an exorcism. The girl arrived with bruises all over her body, but strangely tied up. They told us they tried to get a demon or something like that out of her body, but the process was too much for her, so they had to interrupt it. When I was reading her file and the family was telling me all this, I was genuinely outraged. This poor girl surely had the worst night of her life, and all because of the negligence of a family that refused to believe in traditional medicine because they believed in angels and demons. Anyway, that girl was going to have to stay in the hospital, and we were going to have to be on the lookout for any symptoms she developed. We couldn't do much more than heal her physical wounds. Now it was just a matter of time acting on her. As the night fell, the number of doctors at the hospital was much smaller. Many employees were on strike due to a massive layoff at the hospital, so by evening, there were only a few experienced doctors, a few nurses, and a few residents. I decided to work overtime as I wanted to take care of a woman who had been hit by her husband's car after a domestic dispute. And she was in pretty bad shape. This woman was on the same floor as Jane, and you will soon see why that is so relevant. The nightmare started when I came out to check on the lady. To my surprise, the place was a lot more cold. The air conditioners were working fine as I checked them and felt the heat they were putting out. All the medics were on the lower floors as that was where the emergencies were happening. I walked to the stairs to give them a hand until I came across something that caught me off guard. I passed by one of the rooms, and the ceiling was moving by itself. All the ceiling panels were being violently hit, but there was no one around. At first, I thought it might be a tremor, but it didn't make any sense. A tremor in just one room? I took out my cell phone and filmed it as soon as possible. I needed an explanation for this, and someone was going to have to give it to me. Uncomfortably, I walked away from the room, and that's when I saw her. It was Jane. She was across the hall, looking at me. She was standing in perfect health, looking in my direction. Hey, Jane? I know you must be pretty confused. You're in the hospital. My name is D. At that moment, the girl simply left as if bored by what I was saying to her. At that moment, I knew I could not allow her to walk the halls so freely. This girl was in a coma very recently. Who knows if she was confused or scared by everything she experienced? She was not only a danger to the rest of the patients, but to herself. I ran after her as fast as I could, but when I got to the end of the hallway and turned in the direction she went, I saw something else. At the end of the new hallway was a stretcher, but not just any stretcher. The same stretchers they use in the morgue. Do you know what else was on top of the gurney? A white bag with a corpse in it. Seeing that image, I was both horrified and confused. I pulled one more time and recorded this before taking it out, but as I was doing so, something else happened. The bag with the corpse, it raised its head. What was going on? Was I being made a bad joke? No, none of my companions would have joked with something like that. Seeing this image, I walked frightened towards the stairs. I didn't know what was going on, but I had to get out of there. I was a few steps away from the stairs, and that's when, in an impulsive act, I turned my head to Jane's room. She was in bed. What? I entered her room in confusion. She was there exactly as she had been left. That couldn't be. I had seen Jane just a few seconds before, and she had gone in another direction. She had gone to a dead end. There was no way she was going back to bed without crossing me. At that moment, all the exorcism stories about Jane started to rattle me. Maybe just for that moment, I believed them and realized I was in the wrong place. I had to get out of there as soon as possible. I ran to the door, but I couldn't open it. It was locked. I was locked in Jane's room. I started to hear sounds behind me. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to confirm my suspicions, but there she was, pointing her finger at me, standing up, staring at me. I panicked and banged on the door as hard as I could, but it wouldn't open. Meanwhile, Jane fell off the bed and was crawling towards me, slowly, dragging with the respirator to which she was attached. Once she reached my foot, she began to climb up to stand on it, using my clothes to hold on and get face to face with me. Kill me. I was speechless, totally frozen with fear, not knowing how to react. From 1 second to the next, I could see Jane's face change. She became more skeletal and scarred. Don't let him take me. As soon as she finished saying that sentence, I felt much colder in the room. The place got darker, and I could see something taking shape from the shadows. It was some kind of goat, but standing up on 2 legs. Its face was horrible, even demonic. Its eyes were red, and its very presence made me tachycardia. And I fell to the floor. At the same time, Jane also fell to the ground, but not on her own. Something invisible was grabbing her foot, pulling her into darkness. She cried desperately and begged for help as her body continued to lose weight and become more and more skeletal. From the darkness, I could hear a small mocking laugh, and suddenly, I woke up. When I opened my eyes, I was in Jane's room. The door was open. Apparently, I had fainted. Jane was lying in her bed, still in a coma. I opened the door and ran as fast as I could down the stairs and met up with the other doctors. When we checked on Jane in the morning, she was already dead. There was nothing we could do. She went from being stable to suffering a sudden death. It's been a while since then, and to be honest, I still have no idea what I saw. I didn't leave the hospital. People needed me. But you know, I was never alone on any floor again. The night shift is not for me. And I feel sorry for the poor devil who will live again a situation like the one I lived through in the hospital. How many of you believe in urban legends? To tell you the truth, I was always a fan of them, but I never believed in any of them. I always took them as entertainment, but I was skeptical of them. Until, like any other person who starts to believe in something, I had to live one myself. It all started a few years ago during my vacation when I decided to go to a small town called San Miguel. I had just finished my exams at the university and I needed a break to disconnect. San Miguel was perfect for that, with its cobblestone streets, adobe houses, and quiet atmosphere. I stayed at a small inn in the center of town, run by a kindly old woman named Dona Rosa, my aunt. I had been working non-stop for months, and my boss had suggested I take a few days off. Even on my vacations, I was always a person who tended to try to get ahead of work or get too stressed out with it. So I looked for a small place that was isolated enough so that I wouldn't be tempted to check emails or answer work calls. San Miguel, with its lack of cell phone coverage and no internet access, was the ideal place. The first night passed without incident. I explored the town, talked to some locals, and allowed myself to relax a bit. Everything seemed perfect. I visited the main square, enjoyed a home-cooked meal at a small restaurant, and finished the day reading a book at the inn. The second night, after a day exploring the nearby hills and visiting a waterfall that had been recommended to me, I returned to the inn quite tired. I went up to my room and prepared for sleep. However, I could not sleep. I felt that something was wrong, but not in the paranormal sense, or those things you might imagine. But I was uncomfortable. I was a little more accustomed to it always being noisy falling asleep, looking at my cell phone or watching a movie on a streaming platform. As relaxing as it could be to be away from technology, for someone as accustomed as I was to using it, it could get a little weird to be so separated from it. I tossed and turned in bed for a while, staring at the ceiling and trying to fall asleep, until I realized I couldn't do it and decided to go for a walk. The cool night air might help me relax. I got dressed, went downstairs quietly so as not to wake Dona Rosa, and went out into the deserted streets of the town. Perhaps this was one of the things that surprised me the most about the town. During the early morning, it was deserted. I mean, I know everyone is supposed to sleep in the early morning, but you always find someone walking around or a car running. This was not the case here. The streets were empty, and there was absolute silence. I walked along the cobblestone streets, enjoying the silence and the starry sky. The lights of the houses were off, and only the wind could be heard. I reached the outskirts of town and sat down on a bench near an old dirt road. There were no lights here, but the moon was illuminating the entire road. That's when I heard it. At first, it was a distant sound, a faint rustling that could have been anything. But gradually, it grew louder. Something was creaking, like an old cart. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind or some nocturnal animal, but the sound kept getting closer. I decided to head back to the inn, but before I could take a step, I saw it. There, on the dirt road, an old, broken-down wagon was moving slowly along. There were no horses, no driver, no nothing, just the wagon moving on its own. The grinding of the wheels on the ground was very intense. I admit that I was creeped out, but besides that, I was very curious. What was a wagon doing alone in the middle of the road with no one around? The wagon stopped right in front of me. The air around me became icy. I felt a presence, something I couldn't see, but was there. Fear came over me completely. I tried to back away, but my legs didn't respond. Then, an icy whisper reached my ears, as if the wind was trying to tell me something. I looked inside the wagon. What I saw chilled my blood. Human bones, skulls, rotting pieces of flesh. All of it was piled in the empty wagon. I fell to my knees on the ground and felt like vomiting. I hadn't realized it, but I felt a terrible smell of putrefaction coming from inside. The cold began to grow and grow, but this was not an ambient cold. Something in my body was wrong. I recognized that cold. It was the cold I felt when I got sick. I touched my forehead, and yes, indeed, I was boiling. I had a fever. How could it be that from one moment to the next, I got sick like that? I gathered the strength to get up, but the fever made everything much more complicated. I guess it also made me more confused because it was hard to recognize where I was. It was no longer the wagon that frightened me, but everything around me. I was so confused that the road itself, the trees, the seat I was on, everything confused me and terrified me. It was driving me crazy. When I was finally able to stand up, I fell again before taking the first step. My body didn't respond. I couldn't keep my balance at all. In the middle of the confusion, I heard footsteps in front of me. A man in a black robe was standing with his back to me, lifting the cart, ready to keep it moving. Before I could move any further, the man turned around. That was no man. It was not even a living being. That in front of me was a skull. The skull's gaze pointed in my direction for a few seconds. Seconds in which I was like hypnotized. I was lost in the sockets of his eyes. They felt like spirals that were absorbing me. After a few seconds of staring, I had no idea where I was. I only knew that breathing was becoming more and more difficult. It was very cold, and my body was still hurting a lot. I was running a fever. But no matter how high the fever was, I knew that what was in front of me was not a hallucination. In all this wondering and confusion, I realized something even more terrifying. The figure was getting closer and closer to me, but he was not approaching me. How could this be? Why was I seeing him closer and closer? It was then that I realized that he was not walking towards me, but that I was walking towards him. As soon as I realized this, I jumped backward and fell to the ground, terrified and confused. I had come out of some kind of trance state that was leading me to the skeleton and his cart. When I realized what was happening and got out of danger, the being just stared at me for a few more seconds. Then it turned, and as quickly as it had come, it simply left, ignoring me and pretending I was not there. As he left, I could feel my body slowly recovering from the fever and confusion. From one second to the next, I was much better. I was as good as I was before everything happened. When I felt completely well, I ran in another direction to my aunt's house. When I arrived, Dona Rosa was waiting for me in the lobby with a look of understanding and concern.
You saw the cart, didn't you?
I nodded, unable to speak. She took me to the kitchen and poured me a cup of hot tea, whispering prayers to ward off evil. Neither of us talked about what had happened. I didn't feel I could talk about it. And I also knew that no one would believe me. My aunt, on the other hand, didn't want to talk. And it was at that moment that I felt I didn't have to. Somehow, she already knew everything. The next morning, Dona Rosa told me everything I needed to know about what I had seen. The explanation was not long, but I'll just tell you what I saw. That was an urban legend called La Carreta Chiona. And what I saw moving the wagon, that was said to be death itself. After that, I left town without saying a word. I knew the legend of the squeaky wagon. What I didn't know was that it wasn't just a story to scare the curious. It was a real legend, and I had been lucky enough to escape with my life. Not because I was smart, fast, or daring, just because whatever I saw that night wasn't interested in me enough to do anything to me.
Hi, my name is Richard, and today I'm going to tell you a story of something that I thought was an urban myth, of something that I thought was impossible, until it happened. I used to be a very skeptical person. I thought urban legends were just that, legends. Stories that were told to scare kids or to hang out with friends. Honestly, I never thought something like that could happen to me. I always thought I would be on the other side, watching videos and wondering how much of it could be real. That night I realized some things were infinitely beyond human understanding. I realized how small we are in this world, and how there are things that we should never understand. It all started when my friend Javier convinced us to go explore an old abandoned psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of town. According to him, the place was haunted. The truth is that the place had not been in operation for many years, and the government had pretended that the place never existed, leaving it abandoned. After that, it is only natural that everyone thinks it is haunted and many false stories are told about it. One of the best-known legends of the place was that it had been the scene of many tragic events, including the death of a young nurse named Isabel, who was brutally murdered by a patient. Since then, her spirit, known as the Lady in White, wandered the corridors of the hospital seeking revenge. At first, I laughed at the idea of doing an urban exploration. I had never been attracted to horror stories and thought Javier had seen too many of them, to the point where I thought it was exciting to explore an abandoned place. For my part, I didn't believe in ghosts or anything like that, but it was a Friday night and we had nothing better to do, so I agreed. Maybe it would be fun. We arrived at the hospital just as the sun was setting. The front of the building was covered in graffiti and most of the windows were broken. Javier was very excited, so I tried not to laugh anymore and just enjoy the show. Inside though, I was thinking things like, if the place is haunted, how come it's covered in graffiti? I didn't care to look for the logic behind it and just played along with Javier, and we kept looking for a way in. There was a rusty fence around the place, but someone had already cut a hole big enough for us to get through. Javier, always being the bravest of the group, was the first to go in. The two of us followed. I must admit that the inside of the hospital was terrifying. The corridors were filled with debris and everything was covered with a thick layer of dust. The place smelled musty and the silence was overwhelming. Only our footsteps and voices could be heard. We walked down several corridors, entering dark and empty rooms. In one of the rooms we found rusty beds and overturned wheelchairs. Javier was still quite amused, but I was beginning to feel uncomfortable. Haven't you ever been unjustifiably afraid? That was happening to me. It was a bad feeling that was getting bigger and bigger, but there was no way I was going to leave just because of that. Finally, we came to a staircase leading down to the basement. Raul, my other friend, hesitated. On the other hand, for the one who believed the most in the paranormal, Javier was very calm, insisting Raul to go in until he finally agreed. So, with no other options, we descended. The basement was even darker and more humid than the rest of the hospital. The light from our flashlights barely illuminated the way. The corridors were narrow and never seemed to end. We walked awkwardly, but suddenly we heard a noise. It was a whisper, barely audible, but enough to make our hair stand on end. Javier, trying to stay calm, said it was probably the wind, but I knew there was no wind down there, and even if there had been, that was closer to a human voice than a little wind. We kept going, but the rustling was getting louder. It seemed to be coming from everywhere, and to top it off, we thought it was a person who needed help, but we couldn't find them. We came to a door at the end of the corridor. It was ajar, and when we pushed it open, we found ourselves in a kind of operating room. There were rusty stretchers and surgical tools scattered across the floor, but most disturbing was the large mirror on one wall. It was broken, and the shards of glass reflected our flashlights, creating strange shadows. Suddenly, the whisper became a sound. We stood still, trying to identify the source. The crying seemed to be coming from a dark corner of the room. Slowly, we directed our flashlights to where the sound was coming from. There, in the corner, was a figure. At first, we couldn't see it clearly, but as we adjusted our flashlights, the figure became more visible. It was a woman, curled up on the floor, crying inconsolably. She wore a white nightgown, soiled and stained, and her hair fell in a tangled mess over her face. She seemed completely oblivious to our presence and lost in her grief. I tried to say something, but the words got stuck in my throat. At that moment, none of us sought to relate this girl to any paranormal event or urban legend. We all thought she was a girl to whom something had happened. Maybe she was homeless, or maybe someone followed her here to rob her or harass her. Javier approached the girl and asked her if she was okay, with me and Raul behind him, also concerned. The woman did not respond. She continued to cry. We decided to approach cautiously. This girl was crying too much, so we thought she might be in shock and we didn't want to scare her too much. As we got closer, the air around us cooled perceptibly. Suddenly, the woman stopped crying and raised her head. Her eyes were dark and empty, her pupils completely dilated. She stared at us and a shiver ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. Why were her eyes like that? Was she drugged? We started to back away slowly, but then the woman jumped up, moving unnaturally. She didn't look human, and she was moving towards us. We turned and ran for the door, but before we could reach it, it slammed shut. Panic took hold of us. We tried to open the door with all our might, but it was stuck. I could feel her behind me. Not because I was seeing her or because she would make noise, but with every step she took in our direction, the room got colder and colder. Suddenly, the lights of our flashlights began to flicker. They were all going out at the same time. The room was plunged into almost total darkness. Desperate, I started looking for something, anything that could help us. I found an old metal bar on the floor and started banging on the door with all my might. The noise was deafening, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. Javier joined me, and together we managed to open the door a little. We were about to escape, but I turned to look at Raul. He was completely paralyzed, and the woman was grabbing his face. She was face to face with Raul, who had his eyes open in a way I had never seen in my life. The woman was squeezing his face very hard, slowly moving down to his neck. I could see that she had intentions of choking him, and Raul did nothing about it. Javier told me to get out, but I wasn't going to let anything happen to my friend. I rammed him as hard as I could and he fell to the ground, passing through the woman's hand as if he were a ghost. I told him to run, but he didn't react. I had to grab his arm and force him out of the room. We ran down the hallway without looking back. I could feel the woman's presence behind us. I could hear her crying once again, but I didn't dare turn around. I just wanted to get out of that damn hospital as fast as possible. Finally, we reached the staircase and ran up it. We ran out of the building and didn't stop running until we reached the fence. We jumped through the hole and ran away from the hospital without looking back. We stopped only when we were far enough away. We were exhausted and scared, but alive. Javier was pale and shaking. Raul couldn't stop looking toward the hospital in shock, with the same look he had when the woman was in front of him. We never fully recovered from that. Javier is much more fearful, and I now believe in the paranormal. As for Raul, he is the one who had the hardest time getting over what happened. After that night, it took him a long time to leave the house again. Today, he still hangs out with us, but I could swear he has changed. He became more solitary, sad, and quiet, and every time we wanted to talk to him about it, he changed the subject. Only he knows what he must have seen and felt during that night when the lady in white came face to face with him.